In October 2001, Sandra Stotler, a 50-year-old nurse and mother of two, was inside her home in Conroe, Texas, when she was shot twice in the back and killed. Her body was later discovered dumped in a lake near her neighborhood. Just hours after her murder, her 16-year-old son Adam and his 18-year-old friend Jeremy Richardson were also found dead, executed in a wooded area, shot in the head. At the center of this unraveling tragedy was a 19-year-old named Michael James Perry, a troubled young man with a long history of drug use, violent behavior, and mental illness. To understand how 3 innocent lives were stolen in a senseless act of violence, and how Perry ended up on Texas's death row, we need to go back to where it all began. Michael James Perry was born in 1982 in the United States, though the details surrounding his early biological family are sparse and largely undocumented. What is known, however, is that from his earliest days, Michael's life was defined by abandonment. His birth parents gave him up when he was still very young, leaving behind no legacy except a gaping wound of rejection that would haunt him throughout his life. By the time he was adopted, he was already carrying the weight of early childhood trauma. He was taken in by a couple who hoped to offer him love, structure, and a second chance. But even with stability, something in Michael never quite settled. As he grew into adolescence, the signs of deeper trouble began to surface. He started acting out in school, showing signs of emotional instability and defiance. He struggled to regulate his behavior and formed patterns of violence and erratic thinking that concerned both his teachers and his adoptive parents. Diagnosed with various psychological and behavioral issues, including conduct disorder and bipolar tendencies, Michael was placed in juvenile facilities multiple times before the age of 18. Each stay seemed only to harden him further. His life began revolving around a destructive mix of impulsivity, criminal mischief, and drug use. By his mid-teens, Michael had become deeply entangled in methamphetamine and cocaine abuse, narcotics that blurred what little moral compass he had left. He spiraled through a system that documented his decline but failed to stop it. Court records and school files reveal a recurring pattern: arrests, brief detentions, court-ordered counseling, followed by relapse and deeper dives into self-destruction. One of the most telling accounts of Michael's psychological unraveling came years later in Werner Herzog's haunting documentary Into the Abyss, where Michael's adoptive mother gave a heart-wrenching interview. Her voice trembled as she described the transformation of her son, from a curious, awkward boy into someone she could barely recognize. She spoke not just as a parent, but as a witness to a slow-moving disaster, a young man crumbling from the inside out, lost in his own mind and completely unable, or unwilling, to find his way back. Teachers, counselors, juvenile officers, all documented his behavior as dangerous, unpredictable, and volatile. He lied compulsively, often had delusions of grandeur, and developed an almost total disregard for consequence. Despite numerous interventions, nothing could steer him away from the path he was forging. Even those trying to help him eventually began to fear him. By the age of 18, Michael James Perry wasn't just another troubled teen. He had become a ticking time bomb, one set to detonate without warning. And in the fall of 2001 it finally did. Sandra Stotler was a 50-year-old nurse living in the quiet town of Conroe, Texas, just north of Houston. Known for her kindness, warmth, and dedication to her family, Sandra was a woman whose life centered around caring for others, both as a professional and as a mother. She had raised her children with strength and compassion, and though her household had endured its share of hardship, she remained a steady, loving presence. Her teenage son Adam, just 16 years old, still lived at home, and the two shared a close bond. Their days were simple, their routine ordinary. But all of that would be shattered by the arrival of 2 young men whose lives had taken a very different path. One of those men was Michael James Perry. The other was Jason Burkett, a 19-year-old who, like Perry, had a deeply troubled past marred by violence, drug use, and neglect. Burkett's own childhood was defined by chaos. His father was in prison, his mother was absent, and he had grown up learning to rely on anger and crime as survival tools. It was in this environment that he and Perry became fast friends. They bonded over shared pain, mutual distrust of authority, and a hunger for escape, both from the lives they hated and the consequences they knew were coming. In the days leading up to the murders, Perry and Burkett were broke, on the run, and desperate. They had no home, no money, and no future, only a dangerous idea and access to weapons. Sandra Stotler became a target not because of any personal grievance, but because of something far more banal and horrifying. She owned a red Chevrolet Camaro. That car became the centerpiece of their plan: get the car, ditch the area, and live out some kind of fantasy on the road, far from Conroe, far from responsibility, and far from the reach of the law. The plan was as reckless as it was brutal. On the evening of October 24, 2001, Perry and Burkett went to the Stotler residence. According to court records and Jason Burkett's later testimony, Sandra had agreed to help them with laundry and had even welcomed them into her home out of generosity. What Sandra didn't know was that Perry was armed, and that visit, seemingly ordinary, was about to turn deadly. At some point inside the home, Michael James Perry retrieved a firearm and shot Sandra Stotler twice in the back, killing her almost instantly. The scene turned from casual to catastrophic in seconds. Blood stained the floor of her home, the same home she had worked so hard to protect. And just like that, her life was taken not by a stranger, but by a young man she had likely smiled at only moments before. After the shooting, Perry and Burkett acted with cold efficiency. They loaded Sandra's body into her pickup truck, drove to a nearby lake, and dumped her corpse into the dark water. Then they returned to the house and began the process of cleaning up the blood, mopping, moving things around, trying to erase the evidence. But it wasn't just about covering their tracks. They needed more. Sandra's Camaro wasn't enough for what they had in mind. Perry and Burkett then took the car and headed out, pretending that nothing had happened. They drove it around town, trying to avoid detection while figuring out their next move. But their plan didn't end with one murder. They needed another vehicle, and a cover story. And that meant more blood would be spilled. The Camaro had been the bait, but soon, Adam Stotler and his friend Jeremy Richardson would become the next target. Adam Stotler, just 16 years old, was described by friends and family as bright, well-mannered, and respectful. He was close with his mother and still reeling from the recent death of his twin brother in a car accident, a tragedy that had shaken the Stotler family. Jeremy Richardson, 18, was a loyal friend to Adam. He was outgoing, good-natured, and had recently been working towards steady employment. These two boys had their whole lives ahead of them. They were typical teenagers in a small town, eager to hang out, listen to music, and escape boredom in the company of people they trusted. According to court records and Burkett's own confession, Perry and Burkett approached Adam and Jeremy under the guise of friendship. There were no threats, no visible signs of danger, just a casual invitation to hang out, drive around, maybe shoot guns in the woods. To the boys, it seemed like just another evening with familiar faces. But what they didn't know was that the same people they were getting into the car with had already killed Adam's mother hours earlier, and were now using him to get what they wanted next. The group drove toward a remote wooded area in Montgomery County, not far from the Stotler home. As dusk settled over the trees, the mood changed. It was there, under the cover of woods and shadow, that Michael James Perry and Jason Burkett turned on the boys who had trusted them. Using a .45 caliber pistol, they shot both teenagers in the head, execution style. The autopsy would later confirm that neither Adam nor Jeremy had a chance to defend themselves. It was fast, cold, and methodical. After the killings, their bodies were dragged deeper into the woods and left on the ground, abandoned, nameless to the trees, alone in the dirt. Perry and Burkett then stole Adam's black Isuzu Rodeo SUV and drove off. To them, it was just another step in their plan to escape. To the families left behind, it was the moment their lives were irreparably shattered. Investigators would later find Adam and Jeremy's bodies in a shallow wooded area off Crater Lake Road, not far from where Sandra's body had been dumped. They were side by side, both killed with the same weapon, in what authorities described as an act of calculated betrayal by people the boys had considered friends. After switching from Sandra Stotler's red Camaro to Adam Stotler's black Isuzu Rodeo SUV, Michael James Perry and Jason Burkett believed they had made a clean break. With 2 murders behind them and a third body submerged in a lake, they left Montgomery County thinking they could outrun the consequences. But they couldn't outrun the growing suspicion or the trail of evidence they'd left behind. In the days that followed the murders, law enforcement began tracking both stolen vehicles. The Camaro, found abandoned, had already raised red flags. It was quickly traced back to Sandra Stotler, who had now been reported missing. Soon after, investigators discovered blood inside the car, blood that would later be matched to both Sandra and Adam. Meanwhile, the black Isuzu Rodeo SUV belonging to Adam was seen traveling in the area, now driven by Perry and Burkett. It was just a matter of time. On October 26, 2001, just 2 days after the killings, police in Conroe, Texas, spotted the Isuzu Rodeo and attempted a traffic stop. But instead of pulling over, Perry hit the gas, initiating a high-speed chase through Montgomery County. The pursuit reached dangerous speeds, with Perry weaving through lanes and trying to evade officers. Ultimately, he lost control and crashed the SUV. Officers quickly surrounded the vehicle and took Michael James Perry into custody. Inside the Isuzu, Police found stolen property linked to the victims, including personal belongings and items taken from the Stotler home. Most damning of all, a .45 caliber handgun, believed to be the murder weapon. Shortly after Perry's arrest, Jason Burkett was also apprehended without incident. Both men were now in custody, and investigators wasted no time beginning the interrogation process. Initially, Perry confessed. In interviews conducted by detectives and recorded on video, he admitted to participating in the events surrounding the murders. According to official transcripts, Perry provided a timeline of how the group had gone to the Stotler home, how Sandra had been shot, and how Adam and Jeremy were lured and killed in the woods. His demeanor during the interviews was strange, often erratic, sometimes detached, but his statements were clear enough to implicate himself. However, the confessions wouldn't last. Just days later, Perry recanted, telling his legal team that his earlier statements had been coerced, that he had been under emotional distress, and that he had only confessed because of pressure from the interrogators. He claimed innocence in Sandra's killing and argued that Jason Burkett had been the primary actor. He also insisted that at the time of Sandra's murder, he had already been in jail for a separate incident, an alibi that was ultimately disproven by arrest records. Jason Burkett, on the other hand, took a different approach. While downplaying his own role, Burkett gave investigators a statement that directly pinned Perry as the triggerman in all three murders. According to Burkett, it was Perry who shot Sandra Stotler inside her home, and Perry who later pulled the trigger in the woods when Adam and Jeremy were killed. Burkett portrayed himself as a reluctant participant, claiming he was only there because he didn't know how to say no. The two young men were now fully entangled in each other's stories. Each was trying to shift responsibility. Each was trying to save his own life. But the physical evidence, combined with Perry's initial confession and Burkett's corroborating statement, formed a narrative that prosecutors would use to pursue the ultimate punishment. Following their arrests, Michael James Perry and Jason Burkett were formally charged in connection with the triple homicide that had rocked Montgomery County, Texas. While both faced serious charges, the legal system made a clear distinction between them. Perry, identified as the primary shooter, was charged with capital murder, specifically for the death of Sandra Stotler, whose killing alone was sufficient under Texas law to warrant the death penalty due to the theft and other felonies tied to the case. Prosecutors chose to try Perry first and center their strategy around the murder of Sandra, even though two additional victims, Adam Stotler and Jeremy Richardson, had also been killed. Their rationale was clear. Securing a death sentence for Sandra's murder would render further prosecutions unnecessary. As the trial began in 2003, the state of Texas laid out a case built on overwhelming physical and circumstantial evidence. Prosecutors presented a timeline that was supported by Perry's own initial confession, forensic evidence recovered from the scene, items found in the stolen Isuzu Rodeo, and, critically, the .45 caliber handgun recovered at the time of Perry's arrest, which ballistics matched to the murders. They also presented bloody clothing, fingerprints, and testimony from law enforcement officials who had worked the case. The prosecution didn't stop there. They emphasized Perry's pattern of manipulative and antisocial behavior, painting a picture of a young man who had not only committed murder, but had shown little remorse for it. They played excerpts from his police interviews and highlighted inconsistencies in his recanted statements. They argued that this was not a crime of passion or confusion, but a deliberate, premeditated act carried out with a specific purpose: to steal, to escape, and to eliminate witnesses. Perry's defense team faced an uphill battle. They didn't deny that their client was troubled. In fact, that became the cornerstone of their argument. The defense contended that Perry suffered from severe mental illness, including bipolar disorder and potential cognitive impairments, and had been under the influence of drugs during the time of the killings. They also argued that his confession had been coerced, obtained during hours of intense interrogation while he was in a mentally unstable and emotionally vulnerable state. They tried to shift blame toward Jason Burkett, suggesting that Perry was not the dominant force in the crimes. Mental health experts were brought in to testify that Perry showed signs of delusional thinking and long-standing emotional disturbance. They painted him as a young man abandoned early in life, passed between systems, and failed repeatedly by institutions that should have intervened. But the jury was unconvinced. The details of the crime were too stark, the evidence too strong, and the brutality of the execution-style killings too much to overlook. After hearing all arguments, the jury found Michael James Perry guilty of capital murder. During the sentencing phase, the prosecution presented further evidence of Perry's past criminal behavior, his lack of remorse, and the danger he posed to society. Ultimately, the jury sentenced him to death by lethal injection. Jason Burkett was tried separately, also in 2003. Like Perry, he faced charges of capital murder, but unlike Perry, Burkett was spared the death penalty. The key turning point in Burkett's sentencing came during the penalty phase, when his father, Delbert Burkett, a man serving a long prison sentence of his own, took the witness stand. In one of the most emotionally powerful moments captured in Werner Herzog's Into the Abyss, Delbert Burkett pleaded with the jury to show mercy to his son, taking responsibility for the path Jason had taken and begging the court not to condemn him to die. His voice cracked under the weight of his guilt, describing how his own failures as a father had contributed to the darkness in Jason's life. His emotional testimony struck a chord with the jury. Though they convicted Burkett, they opted instead to sentence him to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. The courtroom was quiet. The damage had been done. But for Burkett, a sliver of mercy was extended, perhaps not for who he was, but for who he might have been under different circumstances. After his conviction and death sentence, Michael James Perry was transferred to the Allen B. Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, a maximum security prison that houses all male death row inmates in the state. The Polunsky Unit is known for its strict conditions and psychological toll. Unlike many prison facilities, death row inmates at Polunsky are kept in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. They live in small, windowless cells measuring roughly 6 by 10 feet, with no physical contact allowed with other inmates. Meals are passed through a slot in the door. Inmates are allowed 1 hour of recreation per day, alone in a fenced-in cage. There is no communal yard, no television, and no educational programs. The isolation is near total. Here, Michael Perry spent nearly 8 years awaiting execution. During that time he continued to maintain his innocence, repeatedly claiming that he was not the one who killed Sandra Stotler, despite having confessed during his arrest, and despite forensic evidence and the testimony of co-defendant Jason Burkett, who placed him at the scene of all 3 murders. Perry insisted that he had been in jail at the time of Sandra's killing, offering this as his alibi during interviews and written appeals. However, this claim was quickly and repeatedly debunked by official jail records and court documents. Those records clearly showed that Perry had not been incarcerated at the time of Sandra's murder and was, in fact, released days before the crime occurred. His insistence on that timeline became a focal point of media attention, particularly as his execution date approached and public scrutiny of the case intensified. One of the most significant media moments in Perry's time on death row came in 2010, when acclaimed German filmmaker Werner Herzog visited the Polunsky Unit to interview him as part of his documentary project exploring capital punishment in the United States. The result was the critically acclaimed 2011 film Into the Abyss, A Tale of Death, A Tale of Life. Herzog's interview with Perry was haunting, tense, and emotionally complex. Perry, wearing prison whites and speaking from behind reinforced glass, expressed a strangely upbeat demeanor. He smiled at times. He spoke of God and redemption. He claimed he had turned his life around and was ready to help others spiritually, even though his appeals had been exhausted and his execution date was imminent. Perry again insisted that he had not killed Sandra, telling Herzog that God knows the truth, and that he had been wrongfully convicted. Herzog, maintaining a stoic but empathetic tone, didn't argue, but neither did he accept the narrative blindly. His interest was not in proving guilt or innocence, but in exploring the moral dimensions of state-sanctioned execution. In narrated reflections within the documentary, Herzog made it clear that while he did not doubt the seriousness of the crimes, he himself was opposed to the death penalty, on philosophical and humanistic grounds. "I don't believe human beings should be executed," he said, "no matter how heinous their actions may be." Herzog's calm voice contrasted sharply with the horror of the story, and in doing so highlighted a deeper conflict. What does justice look like when the outcome is irreversible? The interview with Perry was one of several in the documentary, but it left a lasting impression. It showcased a young man who, despite the overwhelming evidence against him, refused to accept responsibility. Whether it was delusion, spiritual transformation, or denial, Perry remained committed to a narrative that contradicted the documented facts of the case. Outside prison walls, the film sparked debate. Some viewers questioned the justice of the death penalty. Others saw the film as further confirmation of Perry's guilt and a necessary reckoning for a brutal crime. But inside Polunsky, where time moved slowly and the final chapter loomed ever closer, Perry's story neared its conclusion. On July 1, 2010, the long and winding journey of Michael James Perry, a man convicted of the 2001 murder of Sandra Stotler and implicated in the killings of 2 teenagers, came to its final stop at the Huntsville unit in Huntsville, Texas, home to the state's execution chamber, where more than 1,200 people have been put to death since the 1800s. It was a Thursday evening, and the heat outside clung to the air like the weight of history itself. Inside the walls of the prison, the process unfolded with the routine precision that has come to define executions in Texas, a state that, at the time, led the nation in capital punishment. That day, Michael Perry was escorted from his holding cell at the Allen B. Polunsky unit, where he had spent nearly a decade in solitary confinement, and transported the short distance to Huntsville. Under tight security, he was brought into the death house, a small brick building where executions are carried out via lethal injection. His final hours were tightly regulated: last meal, final statements, spiritual counsel, all following protocols set down by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Perry declined a special last meal, and so he was offered the standard prison dinner. As the hour neared, witnesses, both official and personal, were brought into the viewing rooms. Among them were members of the victims' families, correctional officers, journalists, and legal observers. On the other side of the glass, Perry was strapped to the gurney, arms outstretched for lines already in place. The execution chamber was brightly lit, cold, and quiet. At approximately 6:10 p.m., when given the opportunity to make a final statement, Michael James Perry turned his head slightly toward the witnesses and spoke clearly. His last words were, "I want everyone to know I hold no grudges. I forgive everyone. I really do. I'm sorry for everything. I'm ready to go to heaven. I hope to see you there someday." There was no anger in his voice, no hint of defiance, just calm, almost unnerving peace. It was the kind of farewell that some found sincere, others found rehearsed. In the room, reactions were mixed. Some family members remained stoic. Others wept quietly, their grief renewed by the ritual of closure. A few turned away, unable to watch the moment they had waited nearly 9 years to see. Once the drugs began to flow, a 3-drug protocol of sodium thiopental, pancuronium bromide, and potassium chloride, Perry's breathing slowed. His eyes closed. Within seconds his body went still. At 6:17 p.m. he was officially pronounced dead. He was 28 years old. The life that began in 1982 with adoption, unraveled in adolescence through drugs and instability, and ended in an isolated room with a needle in his arm, was over. The witnesses were escorted out in silence. Outside, the sun was still shining. News outlets quickly reported the execution. For some, it was justice served. For others, it was a reminder of the limits of closure. 3 lives stolen, 1 executed, and another locked away. And a community forever changed. Justice may have spoken, but the pain never fades. If you found this story impactful, like, share, and subscribe. What are your thoughts on Perry's final claims of innocence? Let's talk in the comments.